Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new podcast, Founders in Arms, with me, Immad. I'm the founder and CEO of Mercury, and joining me is Raj.
Hey guys, it's Raj Suri, co-founder of several companies, including Lima, Presto, and Lyft. It's an evolution over our last podcast, the Curiosity podcast, where we went deep on technology issues, and we decided to evolve it based on our interests and based on what's authentic to us as tech founders here in Silicon Valley, being really deep on various technology topics in the context of starting companies. And I would say, Immad, you and I are both been founders for well over a decade, about 15 years or more.
Yeah, 2006.
Yeah, so 2007 for me. So it's been probably our entire careers. You know, I didn't have a job before founding a company, so this is really who we are.
Yeah. We also want to do this weekly and talk about some of the kind of recent and relevant topics that founders are thinking about. Feels like there's a lot of commentary out there from kind of VCs and investors and all this kind of stuff, but us founders always have kind of WhatsApp groups and other groups where we're discussing like kind of weekly things and how they impact us. And I thought it would be useful to make a podcast where we can kind of talk about it. And we're also going to have some guests, other founders that we're going to kind of have on, talking about their experiences around those topics as well.
You're referring to All In, right, Immad? The VC's talking. Yeah, let's just get to the point. We're going to be an unfiltered podcast, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge fan of All In. Sometimes it can be a little repetitive, but I think it's kind of fun to hear about it. But I also love just hearing kind of founders talk about like slightly more relevant topics to what we're doing every day. So yeah, I don't want to throw shade on anyone here, Raj.
Well, that's what podcasts do nowadays. You know, there's a lot of shade being thrown, a lot of F-bombs being thrown. It's a new format. It's an exciting format. There's a lot of like very deep conversations happening on the podcast level. I think it's way better than the 5-minute TV hit. You know, people might go on TV.
Oh yeah, I'm a huge podcast fan. So let's kick in. One thing that's been coming up a lot, partly because it's an election year, and partly I think the world has changed a lot, is kind of regulatory capture and how that impacts startups. So I was actually thinking to myself, like, in 2016, no one was talking about regulatory capture or like really thinking about like how is this impacting startups. So, what do you think has changed since then? Why has it become such a relevant topic?
I think it started with that Bill Gurley presentation he did at the All In Summit, right? Speaking of the All In podcast, right?
Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. It's on regulatory capture. People should look it up on YouTube.
Right. I think it started with that conversation and just opened up the whole topic in the tech community. And then it's really, the volume has been turned up to maximum. I think, we recently saw Andreessen Horowitz guys, endorsing Trump, and regulation was a big reason for that. And, there's been a lot of regulatory activity in general. And there's also questions about AI regulation. There's a new bill in California that's being hotly discussed.
SB 1047.
That's right.
The tech industry seems to hate.
Right. Yes. And even I think Nancy Pelosi and other people have come out against. But California is known for doing some crazy things. So, even that may not help.
I think two things are like the overall trend that's led to this. Number one, we kind of ran out of easy SaaS social mobile apps, and startups started raising more money. And if you look at most of the new stuff happening, right, it's like deep tech or fintech even, or crypto, or now AI. Like these things are much they're just more contentious topics like that, like government and people care about.
Yeah. And like things like deep tech touch physical industries, which are often regulated, right? Like if you're innovating on climate science or like, wildfire tech and even nuclear tech and things like that, things we've covered before in our Curiosity podcast, of course, there's going to be regulation around those things.
Yeah, there's tons of regulations around it. And I think the other thing is if you think about like tech kind of lives off hype cycles. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the two recent hype cycles are like crypto and then AI. And both of those are, crypto is obviously in a regulated space like finance and SEC regulations, and then AI much quicker than any other kind of new technology wave has got like regulators looking at it very closely. I think it's partly because of like kind of, Ex Machina and all the kind of long running kind of media perceptions of like AI takeover. And I guess partly because I think when ChatGPT first came out, it was kind of a shocking technology where people were like, whoa, this is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are worried about, people have seen enough Hollywood movies to know that, AI is something that maybe could be dangerous. I personally think there's too much concern about it, but there should be some concern, some level of concern. What really strikes me, having traveled a bit and talked to founders from different parts of the world, is that actually the U.S. is one of the most deregulated places in the world, right? It's Europe is far more regulated. China is far more regulated. We're actually pretty deregulated according to the global standards, and there's good reasons for that. It's the way like our legal system is built. It's hard for the government to put in new regulations. It's getting harder still with the conservative Supreme Court, which has made a few decisions recently that have actually ruled against the administrative state. Important context that, even though there's a lot of conversation about regulatory issues, there's actually way more in other countries.
I think there's some serious grift that does happen through regulation. I mean, in the Bill Gurley talk, he talks about Epic and how there's like a whole set of regulations that is like almost constructed to help them and hurt any competitors to them. So I think certain spaces get kind of captured and become really hard for a startup to come in. One thing I think entrepreneurs don't understand, which I've learned doing Mercury, is I think there's a lack of clarity often, right? There's a pretty large space of like if you take crypto, right? Like if you ask any crypto person that was like, hey, I wish regulations just had clarity. So what actually is happening is, there's no real rules for this new technology. Congress is the only one that can truly make like laws, but they're very slow to act. And, there's all of this kind of other forces. And actually the country is deliberately constructed to have a slow Congress. So then regulators are like, okay, well, I don't have a mandate from Congress. I'm going to be kind of slow and to some extent not be precise, because they, I think in some cases, can't be precise. And then they tend to be selective on where they do act with. They think it's like, overly egregious. So I think the space of unknown is what's like actually kind of frustrating to entrepreneurs, because they would like clarity. They're like, hey, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. And ideally, maybe the laws need to get better about it. Maybe regulators need to get better about it. But I think Silicon Valley would really appreciate like more precise rules about things.
So I actually think one thing that's really interesting is the ability of industries to self-regulate, and like this idea of industry regulation, and also companies to self-regulate. Companies often have a strong incentive to self-regulate because they have reputational damage if they do something that is shady, right? And industries have damage as well, if they do something bad. And so you see, actually, one idea or one example of this is the PCI certifications that exist in payment industries to like make sure that there's less payment breaches. And so Visa and MasterCard basically like enforce that any technology working with their standards have to go through rigorous testing to make sure there's a minimal risk of security breaches, which we went through a lot at Presto. The government's not involved at all. It's these other companies that are involved, and customers look towards those regulations being satisfied, or those industry regulations being passed before they use a technology in this space. And I think that's effective. It's efficient. Everyone has the right incentives. There's no taxpayer money being spent on these things. So, that's kind of a model I think that could be used in other industries, including AI. There are some big players in AI, OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, and those people have an incentive to make sure there's no runaway, AI that's causing damage to society.
All of those companies were working on self-regulation and alignment, actually way further than anything regulation is currently requiring.
Exactly. Yeah. I would think that's a better path for society. But I also understand from the voting public, there's pressure there's fear and there's pressure, especially when something is so public. Like payment standards are not as public, but AI is very public.
I guess one thing we haven't touched on, and we don't want to get too political here, is it does feel like in the last 4 years the Democrats have used kind of the regulatory apparatus to go way further than at least the Trump administration did in the previous 4 years. So, yeah, I think the one that affects every startup in the whole tech industry is kind of this basically chilling effect they've had on M&A. Obviously, stopping the Figma acquisition by Adobe, stopping the Roomba acquisition by Amazon, and I've heard of like tons of kind of smaller acquisitions being like actually stopped, or basically kind of these big tech companies going like, hey, it's just not possible to acquire people right now. Actually, the smaller ones are even less incentivized to do it, right? Because they tend to have the smaller impact on these bigger companies. So I guess that's a question is like, does that have a chilling effect, or is this just a temporary thing and, this goes in waves?
I think there's a perception in Silicon Valley in general that the Biden administration has not been very friendly to tech. We can see that the Biden leadership has not been visiting Silicon Valley as often as, for example, the Obama administration did. Obama felt like he was very close to tech.
Yeah, Obama was almost like a tech president, right? I remember there was that whole thing where a bunch of engineers showed up and fixed like health.gov with like Rails app. And there was a general feeling of like optimism around Obama and tech for sure.
Yeah, huge. And he's a big user of tech. He's a fan of how technology is changing things. He's a fan of how technology creates jobs. So there was a mutual love there. Even folks like Elon Musk were like big fans of Obama. And then Trump. I feel like Trump wasn't like a friend of tech very much at all. Maybe a friend of Peter Thiel, but he had a deregulatory instinct that tech enjoyed. And then Biden, with his pro-labor, focus, maybe, at best indifferent, maybe a little bit, opposed to some of the stuff happening in tech. And there definitely feels like there's been a number of agencies kind of taking action against tech companies. I think crypto is a big part of it, obviously. I think a lot of tech people, and especially investors, are very concerned about that. I'm not sure founders are that concerned about it. I don't think founders care. They're just trying to build a good company. And obviously at a certain stage, at like a later stage, you'd worry about like, oh, can I buy and sell companies and stuff? But when you're starting off, you won't worry about that for at least a few years.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I would prefer there was way more independent public companies. But on the other side, the SEC has also made it so much harder to go public. So ideally, we would make it easier to go public, and we would have like way more tech companies. I just think that would actually be a better world. There would be way more innovation. I guess like a question that is relevant to founders is, should they enter a regulated space, right? Like actually one of the main pieces of feedback I got when I was starting Mercury, this is 2017, is like, hey, are you sure you want to do this? This is a very regulated space. Like, maybe you should go build a SaaS company. And actually there's lots of ideas of making, the ideas I had around Mercury, a SaaS company instead of like a fintech company. I obviously went for it. I think there's kind of benefits in like going after these spaces, but I do think there's also, the other side of it, which is like maybe, there's definitely people that are put off it. So when you look at an idea or you're thinking of an idea, do you try to avoid regulated spaces, or do you think like those are opportunities?
You have to be brave to go after regulated spaces, and I think you need some level of experience, if you look at folks, who have done it, people like you've had a couple of startups under your belt, you can take bigger swings. You're able to attract the capital you need to go after, some spaces which are maybe a bit scarier for a first-time founder. People like Elon going after space, people like Palmer Luckey going after like defense, like these types of things are harder to do when you're a first-time founder. But like the boom guy, Blake is going after airplanes and stuff. So these are some big swings.
Yeah, they definitely require more capital and more persistence.
Yes, and definitely not easy, but they can be very rewarding. I mean, how many great space companies do we know of? Very few. How many, supersonic jet companies? How many, tech defense companies, do we know? It's very few. So you tend to be one of the only ones, but there is probably a lot of, heartache. I know Lyft in the early days, going after the taxi industries and local regulations, that was a big headache, and that was a big challenge. But once they got through that, there was only a couple of companies that did it, and it was only Lyft and Uber, right?
Do you think local regulations are like better or worse to like kind of deal with?
I think the pros and cons, right? I think local is like you have a huge patchwork of different laws that you have to navigate. And so operationally, it can be very intense. Whereas federal, you have this one big giant body, right, of, the beast of the federal government that you have to navigate. It's I think the pros and cons. I think none of them are easy. Both are very difficult, I think.
I think as a startup, the benefit of local is you can do some jurisdictional arbitrage. Like you can go somewhere and like prove a concept in some locale before expanding to like trickier locales.
Totally. Yeah. I think that and certainly, and you're diversified, right? So like if one doesn't work out or if you have 1,000 different localities and maybe, 10% of them are refusing to kind of do what you need to do, you can focus your resources elsewhere. You have another option, whereas the federal government is the only federal government, so.
Yeah. I mean, the way I look at it is if you like break down the GDP of the US, a ton of it's in healthcare, ton of it's in defense, ton of it's in finance. There's a bunch in food. But basically, a lot of it is in regulated spaces, right? In spaces where regulations exist, where there's authorities, where you have to make something that fits the regulatory landscape. So I personally really like those spaces to invest in and to work with founders willing to go after them, because if you solve a real problem there and you do it in a compliant way, the company is huge normally. And there is, to some extent, there's the other side of regulatory capture is regulatory moat, right? Which I don't love, but it's true. Like if you solve, if you become regulated and you do it in a way that follows the laws, then it's just much harder for another startup to do that as well, right? Most of those types of companies often don't have a network effect for a moat, but they do have kind of this regulatory moat.
I think also for founders, they have to decide on what kind of life they want to live, when building a company. Do you want to deal a lot with the government and deal with regulations? There are rewards to doing that, as you said. So if you do it, you could be one of the only companies in the space that do it. But it's also, do you want to do that? Do you want to spend a lot of time thinking about that? Some people might find it very frustrating and, not have the patience for it. They might want to just build an app or, have a SaaS company far away from regulations. In terms of impact, I agree with you. Like founders working in regulated spaces could have a outsized impact because there's so few companies that actually, survive in those spaces.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, another podcast which you introduced me to, Immad, was Vivek Ramaswamy, a podcast where he interviewed Balaji Srinivasan. And, these are two guys who I guess they didn't know each other, but, before the podcast, but turns out had a lot of similarities in their interests and their beliefs. So I thought it was a fascinating podcast. What did you think, Immad?
The good thing about this podcast, which I really liked, is they went really deep in the FDA and bio, and they both built companies in that space. So they're really coming at it from like a deep expertise, and they talked about how you have to do like 2 studies for like was a level 3 clearance or something like that, and even if you do everything according to the FDA spec, they can still kind of reject you based on like what sounded like vibes. So they were talking about the MDMA rejection for a cure to PTSD, even though it's like actually proven to be extremely effective and one of the only cures for it. And I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it really laid a case where, the FDA is seemingly like over-regulating things. I think the interesting thing, which like I don't know what the answer is, but once you make an apparatus like the FDA, it's like a company, right? Like when you hire someone, they want to hire more people, and that's just like this kind of, that's just what the incentive is. And it's the same thing with the FDA. Like they, once they exist, they want to create more rules and hire more people and increase their importance. And like that seems to be happening across a lot of the regulatory apparatus. And so I don't know what's the way out. One thing we haven't touched on is the Chevron ruling, which the Supreme Court did relatively recently, which basically said there previously used to be a mandate that said if the law is ambiguous, the regulators can kind of choose to interpret it how they want. The new one was, well, by striking down Chevron, they basically said, hey, actually, the regulators have to follow the law by the letter. And potentially this changes a lot, but maybe it takes a while for it to happen. So, like, are these drug companies going to go sue the FDA when they don't get approval for these things? Or is it not going to change much? I mean, there was an idea, I think this was also in this podcast, where they were saying that if you want to go fight the regulator, then they might like reject you on some other drug or something like that. So it creates like a disincentive to like argue with them because they have like so much kind of authority over you.
Yeah. There is definitely a thought out there that you have to play nice with the regulators, and especially with the federal government. I know Lyft, for example, in the past did not play that nice with some of them. Right? They tried to, but in some cases, the local folks didn't want to, and then they would basically pull out and kind of force the the hand of the local regulators. But with the federal government, you only have one other body to deal with, so you need to maintain a long-term relationship with them. So yeah, the title of the podcast was "The FDA Has Blood on Its Hands," and I thought what the argument they were making was that the delays that the FDA introduces to approving new drugs basically kills people, right? It harms people because people don't have access to these drugs. And one of the examples they gave also was this recent ruling by the FDA. I think it was about psychedelics and how they can help with PTSD. I think there's a very controversial sort of decision, I would say, that amongst the psychedelic community, which there are a few people in California that highly support psychedelics. But and we've interviewed, I think Jeevan, was it Jishan, yeah, on the podcast in the past. And so it was and then Vivek had this thing where he wanted to dismantle the FDA as part of maybe a Trump administration or part of the administration, and Balaji was like, we have to establish different types of regulation or different bodies, or I guess dismantle in a different way. They were both very focused on how to reduce regulation by the FDA or by all bodies. Vivek famously is like, I want to dismantle the Department of Education or something,
and the FBI, I think.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that he wants to dismantle, and I agree with you. I mean, we know those incentives exist. And there is a question of how much some of these bodies are protecting the public. But I think we also can't take the view that no regulation should exist. There are bad actors out there. There are people who pollute, right? For example, yeah.
Even if you look at the supplement space, right? It's like happens to be the one space that's not like heavily regulated, but there's just so much snake oil and people making bad claims and things like that. So yeah, I find it hard to imagine a world where we don't have some approval body for drugs. It's just it needs to be streamlined somehow.
Yeah, and I do think industry regulation could be the solution. I think there needs to be some certification body, but it doesn't need to necessarily be the federal government. As human beings, we look towards some authority. I personally really struggled buying supplements or anything like that because I'm I don't know what's in here. But if there was an authority on the subject, sometimes I use our mutual friend Dylan, as an authority, but someone who we could trust to say, hey, this is a good thing, then I'll be like, okay, maybe I'll do it. So yeah, I think there needs to be something, but the federal government may not be the right solution for many of these cases.
Yeah, that's a good thought. I would say, I think if you're an entrepreneur, even when it comes to drug development, there's tons of entrepreneurs that go after it. I think with these big things, there's always opportunities to do things and kind of work within the system. So I would encourage any entrepreneur that wants to go for it, regardless of our somewhat complaining attitude here.
Yeah, it is one interesting kind of juxtaposition where you have the Biden administration probably increasing regulation activity, but you have a conservative Supreme Court, which is kind of dismantling the regulatory state to some degree. Depending on who wins the election, we'll see if that battle continues, or if Trump wins, then you can imagine a very different direction on this front.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting check and balance between the, I guess, executive.
The system's working, right? The system's working.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised how well it works once you zoom out. Even the smaller decisions feel like we're going down like a bad route or something.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, this was a really interesting conversation. We're gonna do this weekly, so join us next time, and subscribe and leave us reviews, etc.
Yeah, give us some feedback, and we'll be inviting guests as well. So there's going to be other founders joining us for these conversations. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like us to discuss, we're also open to giving our advice or thoughts on our experiences, how founders deal with so many challenges. So we're happy to chat about that as well. And yeah, this is just a fun conversation, and hopefully it's helpful for folks who want to kind of see what founders care about, founders think about, and how we think about navigating this very unique journey that we go on to start companies and try to change the world.
See you soon.